Welcome to another episode of NCITE Insights. It's an occasional podcast that we're doing here in Omaha at the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center. And I'm really excited about our guest today. With me is Dr. Matt Jensen of the University of Oklahoma, where he is a faculty member and co-director of the Center for Applied Social Research. And he has a much longer resume that he doesn't want me to read because we're just going to get right to it. But one important thing you should know is that Matt leads interdisciplinary teams investigating how people filter and evaluate information they find online. And boy, isn't that the big subject that I think all of America is talking about as it pertains to the election, as it pertains to AI. There's just so many ways to discuss this. But Matt, why don't we just kick it off? Welcome. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your research and background?
Perfect. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Erin. I'm delighted to have the opportunity. It's always fun to chat with you. And you're right. I think a lot of what we see online deserves a lot of scrutiny. And I think that, as consumers, there's lots of opportunities to critically evaluate the information sources that we consume and consult in serious and maybe less serious decisions that we face every day. So I've been interested for a long time in credibility and how we decide what's credible. And this stems from an interest that was seeded back a long time ago when I was a graduate student, and the internet was just kicking off, and lots of participants were joining this new platform, and they were creating all kinds of content, and there wasn't really a way for consumers of this information to figure out what to believe and what not to believe. And so from that time until now, I've been really interested in the things that people pay attention to, what they decide is credible and why, and how organizations can signal credibility to, protect their reputation, their image, their brands. And all of this has kind of fed really a career-long interest in credibility. Now, the flip side of that, I think, is deception, and understanding how people are deceived, understanding how we react to potentially deceptive information, what we do to verify or investigate messages that we find suspicious. That also is something that I'm profoundly interested in. So deception and credibility, those two sides of the same coin, really drive a lot of my interest.
This is awesome. It makes me think when you were talking about your grad school days, I remember my college days when The Onion first appeared on the scene.
Yeah.
And, when you're talking about credibility and deception, and it was just so over the top and hyperbolic and ridiculous, how could this possibly be true? Everybody, consumers were in on the joke. And so I think when you and I were coming of age with this whole era, we were all in on the joke. It was pretty clear what was credible and what wasn't credible. And just yesterday, there was a story about some AI manipulated photos being put out by a campaign saying Swifties for Trump.
Right.
And so I think we are in a cascade of information, a tsunami of information. So there's less time for, I guess, a consumer to evaluate. How have you noticed that with the flood of information here?
Well, there certainly is a volume problem, right? And time is scarce. Investigation, validation, that takes time. And a lot of times what individuals do is they outsource a lot of that responsibility to third parties. And it might be, the platform that they consume information on. It might be, their friends. It might be, legitimate sources of media like trusted journalism sources. But I think it's really important to emphasize that consumers are at a disadvantage when it comes to assessing credibility. There's a limit to what they can know, and this creates a very difficult problem for consumers as they have to navigate information landscapes and decide, okay, well, this is credible, this is not credible. It's hard to do in a cacophony of voices.
So, what have you found sticks? Like, how do consumers process and how quickly are they able to discern that something is not true? Or if it's not true, how does it stick as true?
So much of the credibility assessment process takes place superficially, especially when we talk about online evaluation. And so, you know, things that are claimed, things that are created, things that are easy to create, they have undue weight in online environments that, in a face-to-face exchange or some other format, like, when we're talking on the phone or something like that, may not carry the same weight. And a lot of it has to do just with what kinds of signals, what kind of information is even available online, what can be verified, what can be validated. And we said it before, overload based on the volume also factors in here because not only do we face problems in terms of scarcity, uh, but it's really hard to do it at scale with all of the messages that bombard us constantly. And so these things kind of combine to make individuals prefer heuristic or superficial information processing when they consume messages in online formats, and that makes people susceptible. That makes people susceptible to deception, to misinformation, and sometimes folks can get into trouble.
So, talk about your research for NCITE, in which you are comparing messaging of violent ideological groups versus nonviolent ideological groups, and again the stickiness of these messages and what works to counter them.
Yeah, absolutely. So this project began a number of years ago, and we were interested in, as you said, violent and nonviolent ideological groups and what their online rhetoric was.
Mhm.
And so we were particularly interested in how these groups portray their core tenets to the public, right, to the masses. And we were interested in, the effects these groups have in terms of recruiting, in terms of communicating their core message, in terms of putting a positive spin on the activities they engage in, uh, which for a violent ideological group, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, right? So how would they portray themselves and the violent actions they engage in something that might approximate, social acceptability? Um, and a couple of things that we discovered were that violent groups have some distinct differences in how they message.
Mhm.
They tend to be less positive and more vague. So that's one thing that I think is unique about violent ideological groups. Uh, they also attempt to create a shared sense of identity, but the way that they do that is different for violent groups in comparison to nonviolent groups. Nonviolent groups tend to rely on trust and share and like a shared sense of identity. Violent groups have much fewer instances of invoking trust. And the way that they create a shared sense of identity is by othering different groups that may be opposed to them. So by separating, by drawing a concrete line, that is the way that they create kind of this shared sense of identity among violent group members. But we also noticed, some key differences in the kinds of messages that groups, like official groups, engage in and send out versus like individual members. One of the things that was really interesting was that official group accounts, they tend to be um, much more tentative in the language that they use. So more hedging language, that sort of thing. Individuals in those groups, though, tend to be much more concrete, much less tentative. And one other thing that had to do with the rhetoric that we noticed was there were some differences based on ideology. And so right-leaning groups tended to rely much more on outgrouping.
Mhm.
than left-leaning groups. And so they would use, so the right-leaning groups would use more instances of they, more instances of, language that kind of separates individuals and draws those distinctions I was talking about a minute ago.
Hmm. That's very interesting. And so, but wouldn't trust be an important tenet for a violent group? You'd want to build trust among your membership to curry favor or belonging or grow a movement?
So the answer is yes, absolutely. Among the group members, trust is going to be absolutely important. But remember, the audience of the messages that we're talking about here tend to be the public, right?
Mhm.
And I think what is happening with violent messaging is that they're trying to draw a line between themselves and the group membership, saying that trust should exist within the group, but not necessarily extend outward to members of the public.
I see.
Yeah.
And what you say makes sense as far as they're less positive. So that sort of tracks with
Yeah.
what I would think a violent group would be less positive. But is there something in our psyche that makes us more inclined to, I don't know if it's the old run from the dinosaurs wiring in our DNA that we see a threat and so those negative messages stick? Is that why violent groups can build a following online, that they can create fear or a sense of distrust of the other?
Yes, I think what you're describing is a strong contributor and explanation behind the messaging that we see. Fear, threat, these things are incredibly motivating. And when we encounter these things immediately, we want to react either by drawing up protections among ourselves, or in the case of rhetoric, we want to argue, we want to kind of verbally fight back. And so, that's I think what these groups are tapping into very often is this tendency to respond to threats, to these less positive verbal messages or text messages.
I thought it was fascinating, in one of the reports I had seen that you'd done, that when you talk about establishing an identity, that certain identities would be stickier, and forgive me if sticky is not the right term, but in my brain, that's kind of how I understand it. A sticky message makes you follow it. Then when the identities were maybe mixed, or there were multiple identities, or some identities were stronger than others, can you talk to that?
Yeah. So when we think about credibility, right, and we think about the impacts of messaging and rhetoric, um, who the messenger is matters a lot. And we see this in a variety of contexts. Certainly, we see it in the commercial realm. We certainly see it, in marketing and in other places. And the same type of phenomena exist here when we think about ideological groups and how they present themselves online. Um, and we talk about this in terms of social identities, right? So the identity of the person and the characteristics of that person who is the communicator.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we've learned is that when you, as a communicator, invoke certain kinds of identities, this is going to have consequences for the reactions of the people that receive the messages that you send out, right? So, for example, one of the distinctions that we've drawn has to do with inherent versus chosen social identities. And so, an example of an inherent social identity might be like race or ethnicity. It's something that you're born with, right?
Mhm.
And this is in contrast to chosen social identities, things that we choose, things that we acquire over time, that we present to others, right, as kind of a reflection of who we are and what our preference is. And so an example of a chosen social identity might be like affiliation with an ideological group or like a political party or something like that, right?
Or yeah, being a
Um,
Broncos fan. It's my husband. It's his chosen identity. He would tell
Okay,
you the
that
same
works
thing.
too. Yeah,
Yeah,
and that is definitely, I think that qualifies as a member of an ideological group, right? When you
definitely.
think,
Questionably violent or nonviolent. I don't know what that is.
yeah, and when we think about these these social identities and how they impact receivers' preferences and attitudes. There are effects here, right? And so when we think about communicators talking about, for example, a controversial issue, let's say like something that crosses or that that different different members of ideological groups would respond differently to, right? So there's some controversy here. So for example, like a death penalty, or for like voting requirements, identification requirements, right? These would be some controversial issues that we've studied. And what's interesting is that inherent social identities in the studies that we've done, they tend to create reactions in receivers when they're invoked in the messaging around these controversial issues. Inherent social identities, they tend to produce more negative reactions, which is interesting. But chosen identities tend not to produce the same kinds of reactions. Now, there's a flip side to that, though. So we have, negative reactions coming from inherent social identities, but those messages from people who invoke those identities are also more memorable. People tend to recall those messages, and because of it, they tend to be impactful, right? As people recall them and as they kind of stick in your mind. And so I think this is the effect you were referring to when you were saying, hey, there's some things that are more sticky. Well, when you invoke an inherent social identity in discussions around a controversial issue, it tends to be easier to recall for people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You had mentioned earlier to me that your expertise when we're looking at the effect of radicalization online, I know I'm kind of jumping up here, but radicalization is maybe an endpoint of a series of online messages, right? In which you may have started here in your thinking and now you're here. Can you kind of walk me through how that works with young people and what then can be done to counter it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done a lot of work with college-age populations, and one of the things that we've observed that was striking is that exposure to extreme messages online around controversial issues tends to move people. It tends to be polarizing. And this is a surprising thing, I think, for me as somebody who's studied, message processing and, reactions to branding and things like that in a commercial environment, because people's pre-existing attitudes tend to rule everything else. It's really hard to move people when they already have, a preference or an attitude about it. But one of the things that we saw, and we actually saw this repeatedly in the studies that we've done, is that as you expose people to, very extreme messaging, either, for or against a particular issue, it tends to move people. And so if we compare their pre-existing attitudes with their post attitudes, after they've been exposed to some of this extreme messaging, their attitudes shift. Which is that's a remarkable thing, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about well, what's the process of radicalization? One of the things that I think we underestimate is the mere effect of exposure.
Okay.
Right? Just being exposed to messaging has a polarizing effect. Now, that's not to say that pre-existing attitudes don't matter, right? Because the direction of the polarization is determined by our pre-existing attitudes. If we lean one way on an issue and we're exposed to extreme messaging about that issue, chances are really good we're going to be a little further along in the same direction as our pre-existing attitudes, only more extreme.
It's interesting because I think, most people, or at least most listeners to this podcast, are not going to be consider themselves radicalized, right? They won't see themselves that way. But if you look at the more subtle influences of essentially what is advertising on steroids, anybody with a tween daughter like I have will just watch her fascination with Sephora. And this is a whole movement of young girls who are buying more expensive beauty products than their mothers. This is not an, extremist group or really, it's not some kind of but it is something that has an effect that has happened through constant exposure to this idea of this is how you should be. And it's interesting for me just as a parent to observe that needle moving, a different daughter moving into a dorm. I mean, I will tell you, every single kid in America needs an air purifier for some reason for their dorm room. This is not what I was on my Target shopping list 30 years ago, right? But like just the volume and the similarity maybe, and the idea that this is something, it's interesting psychologically to watch that needle move with people I'm close to. And so that when the message is negative, when the message causes an extreme reaction, as you say, you can actually, in a way, change someone's thinking, change someone's then behavior along that path. So how do you interrupt it, Matt? What hope do we have?
Yeah, so the interruption is a thorny issue. And there's a couple of things that we've thought about, that we've empirically tested, and I can talk a little bit about those things. One of the things that that people have talked about is the idea of counter messaging, where you say, you present facts, and then you say, hey, what you're talking about here minimizes alternative perspectives. It doesn't take into consideration legitimate issues. Maybe in some cases dehumanizes like a group of people. And I think there's kind of this a rush to counter those messages, right? Whenever we encounter something that we don't agree with, that's forcefully stated, maybe even in an extreme way, our immediate reaction is to say, you're wrong. This is why you're wrong, right? And not only are you wrong, but you have there's some moral problem with you, right?
You're the devil. Yeah, you're wrong.
That's right. You're the devil. And one of the things that we've discovered is that doesn't work very well. As a matter of fact,
yeah, they don't like being called devils, do they?
No, they don't. That doesn't work very well. As a matter of fact, it contributes to greater division, right? So we've seen a boomerang effect that comes from that response. And I mention that because the draw to engage in that kind of dialogue is very strong, right? And we see it there. And it's when somebody makes a forceful comment like that, there's a strong temptation to to hop on and say, no, you're wrong, and argue just as forcefully, maybe even escalate. But that doesn't work very well, right? It doesn't work very well.
And let me pause you for a second. Does it not work? And I may be re-examining conversations with my husband at the kitchen table. I think this, you think that, you're wrong. And when I notice you do that, someone gets defensive. Is that why it doesn't work? Because just simply saying you're wrong, and not only are you wrong, you're wrong morally, that just puts people's defenses up?
I think that the defensiveness, I think probably is a contributing factor. But when we talk about ideological issues, and this often intersects with like issues around policy and what the federal government should do and what our laws should be and how large populations of people should behave. That kind of crosses into a different realm because the consequences are so significant.
Right.
And when we think about what the effects of countering like that are, there are a number of reasons why I think we see this boomerang effect. The first one, in addition to being defensive, but the first one is, hey, if let's say that the countering takes place against some argument that somebody on the right lays out. Somebody on the right might look at countering by somebody on the left and say, okay, well, this is evidence that I'm doing the right thing, for example, right?
Right.
Or, just by virtue of the fact that they're being ignored, or they're being countered, or their perspective is being diminished somehow, that strengthens their resolve to argue more forcefully for what it is they believe in. right? Because, they may perceive that, their perspective is somehow being minimized, even though they feel it's justified. Um, so, those are two additional things that we've observed that might contribute to this boomerang effect. I think that there's definitely more, in addition to, defensiveness and, kind of using as evidence opposing argument. Um, but there's a lot of different reasons why this happens. But the takeaway, though, is that it does happen. And, countering, like we're all tempted to do, might not deliver the outcomes that are hoped for.
So what is an effective example of countering?
So what we've found in terms of countering, what we found to be a little bit more effective is what we call uncertainty reduction. So there's different categories, different types of countering, but if we talk about uncertainty reduction, and when I say uncertainty reduction, what I'm talking about is like laying out facts that are well sourced, that add that add information to a conversation, and that will more or less be acceptable to the parties in the interaction. Now, I hedge around that a little bit because, sometimes sourcing from an authoritative source like the federal government, right, that's not going to be authoritative in everybody's mind. But if you can provide facts and you can say, okay, well, we're making assumptions about whatever this controversial topic is, and kind of lay out some facts, that tends to be more effective than, countering and arguing and engaging in a way that questions the morality of the other person.
I mean, I just love this conversation. It's so fascinating, and I know we got to wrap up, so I'm sorry about that because
Oh,
I'd love to go down this rabbit hole for a long time. I just feel like it would be of such public use. But what are some maybe wrap-up points you could offer or examples?
so I think there's one other thing that I'll mention in terms of, what to do in response to rhetoric like this.
Okay.
And this harkens back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, when we were talking about the messenger and characteristics of the messenger. One of the things that we noticed was that social identities also come into play when we think about ways to mitigate extremist messages. And we did a series of experiments kind of testing this idea, and we saw that when we have, for example, like an extremist nationalist message on a controversial topic, right? Kind of lays it out there. If that message can be countered by somebody with an adjacent social identity,
Okay.
so somebody who's kind of in the same camp, but not necessarily a member of, some nationalist party, that tends to be more effective, right? And so
Interesting.
I'll
Yeah.
I'll give you some examples that we used, or one example for time. So we were looking at nationalist messaging, right? And it had again to do with controversial topics. I think in this case it was voter identification.
Okay.
And when we had somebody chime in who claimed like a veteran status,
Mm.
or something that was adjacent, not part of it, but close,
Mhm.
um, then that tended to be effective.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Because of it, does it get to the idea of credibility then?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Right, because they can claim, and they have a lot of credibility. And when they say, no, this is not something that we need to accept, it's believable.
Mhm. I mean, I think we're just seeing your research play out in our public discussions of any issue. You can pick whatever it is, and that people's political identities have grown stronger because we're so polarized. And yet they're more superficial, I would say. If you are left, you must be for this, and this, and get on board the bandwagon. And if you're for the right, you're the opposite and get on the bandwagon. And it just gets reduced to this black, white discussion, which of course is not really life. Life is so many shades of gray. What can we look forward to coming from you, Matt? What's on tap next?
Well, we have, some more work that we're interested in terms of mitigation. This is a field that is hard, kind of understanding, different strategies that individuals and groups can use to counter extreme messaging. We have, a number of ideas for experiments that we're fleshing out right now, that we plan on running in the near future. And so hopefully we'll have some more to say about, what to do when individuals encounter messaging of an extremist nature, and what groups can do as well.
I mean, that is definitely a part two. So you got to promise to come back so we can get into this a little bit more. I'm sorry there's never enough time, but just in the interest of our listeners, we'll kind of end it there. But everybody, we've had Matt Jensen from the University of Oklahoma on NCITE Insights. He's been a longtime NCITE researcher. We're so happy he's part of the consortium, and tune back in for more. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great day, Matt.
You too.